I want to say this as I'm closing. All sin, conscious or not, is followed by penalties. Now, I want you to get this. All sin, look at that, all sin, conscious or not, is followed by penalties. What this simply says is that there is a penalty to sin, whether you know it or not. That's irrelevant. Whether I know it or not, there is a penalty to sin. Look at this. Genesis chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you so angry? And why do you look annoyed? Verse 7. If you do well, believing me and doing what is acceptable and pleasing to me, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, but ignore my instructions, listen to this. Sin crouches at your door. Its desire is for you to overpower you, but you must master it. From the very initiation of sin in the world, God makes it very, very clear the power of sin. He says that when you don't do that which is normal or pleasing to God, you don't have to wait on sin. It says that sin crouches at the door. And I want to give you a picture. In the Hebrew, it would look like a lion that is waiting and hiding for the deer just to come by. He is waiting. He's on his back legs and he's just waiting. And he sees the deer coming. And as soon as the deer passes, he launches out, he leaps out, and the deer is dead. It's just over. And this is what God says about sin. He says that when we don't do the right thing, sin is right there. It's right there. You don't have to look for it. You don't have to wait for it. It is right there. There is an inevitable penalty to sin. You never sin and get away with it. There is a penalty to sin by default. It is inevitable. I want to give you a story that I heard a while back, because I do understand that there are people who live by the understanding, the notion, they subscribe to the understanding that God won't hold you guilty or accountable for what you don't know. Well, let me give you this. Sometime back in the late 80s, there was a gentleman that was in a car, and he was coming from Wisconsin to Illinois. And as he's driving, he's pulled over by the state trooper. Well, the trooper comes up to his car. He asks him for his license and registration, and he begins to write out his ticket. Well, as he's writing, the gentleman would ask of him, tell him, I didn't know that it was against the law for my child to be in the back seat without a safety chair. He says, I'm from Wisconsin. I didn't know that. So the sheriff, he just continues to write. Then the gentleman would ask of him, how can you give me a ticket for something that I didn't know? After having said that, the officer stops writing and he looks him square in the eye. And he says, I'm not giving you a citation for your ignorance. I'm giving you a citation because you broke the law. You violated the law. Listen to me. Whether or not you are conscious when the law is violated, there are consequences, inevitable penalties. Sin is attached to penalties. This is why it's so important. If you remember, at the beginning, I gave you 3 instances. There are those who are defeated because they don't know. That's not an excuse. You need to be in the Word of God. You need to study the Word of God so that you'll know what is natural for God. And by knowing what is natural behavior, what is a natural thought process, by default, you know what is not natural. You need to know that. Why? Because when you are defeated, the fact that you don't know, that you didn't know, is irrelevant, and yet you become a part of the penalty. There's a penalty. The second one is that we have to make sure that we get to the point that we care when we are defeated. That we care. Because you can have times in your life when you are defeated and you just let it go by. You don't worry about it. There is yet a penalty. It's not until you care, not until you have this inner desire to please God. It's not until that point that you really care. But yet there is a penalty to sin. And then you graduate to where Paul is, where you realize that I can't do it on my own. You realize that on the one hand, with my mind, I want to serve God, but on the other hand, with my flesh, my actions are in contrast. You realize that through Jesus Christ, I have victory. It is not until chapter 8, and that's where we go next week, that he gives us the details of the victory that we have. But I want to leave you with